Welcome to the Life After Sugar podcast. The podcast that's not just about sugar, but about your relationship with it and also with food and especially with yourself. So if you want to discover your life after sugar and hear inspiring stories from all kinds of people who also cut out sugar in their way, at their pace, for their own reasons, this is the podcast for you. Because when you take away the sugar, you can finally discover the real sweetness in your life. I'm your host, Netta Gorman, and today is a special Valentine's Day episode, and I want to talk to you about sugar and love, or rather, our love for sugar, where it comes from, and what it makes us do. I don't know about you, but I used to have like a love-hate relationship with sugar, and I wasn't even aware of it until I stopped eating sugar and really had time and space to step back and think about or analyze the type of, toxic relationship that I used to have with sugar and other types of comfort foods, and how I normalized it in a society where using sugar is more normalized than actually enjoying our food. At least, that's how I experienced it. This reminds me of episode 21 of this podcast, where I talked about, does sweet necessarily mean treat? Or vice versa. If you feel like a treat, and there's nothing wrong with feeling like you deserve a treat, but does that treat necessarily or automatically have to be sweet? I realize that humans enjoy sweet tastes right from the very start of life. Do I remember what breast milk tasted like? No, I don't remember what it tasted like, but I do get the biological and scientific explanation that sweet tastes evolved as a way to detect sources of glucose, and that we're naturally more averse to bitter tastes because they signal to us that maybe the food contains toxins. But the strange thing is for me, since I stopped eating sweet foods in 2015, is that now my love for sweet tastes has been replaced with my enjoyment of other tastes, including bitter, sour, and umami, which is like a salty, savory taste. So, what does that say about my former love for sweetness? Was it true love? Or was it biology or habit? And you may or may not know that I'm an English teacher and have been all my career, so please excuse me when I quote the dictionary for some definitions of love. Because seeing as I'm talking about love and food, and specifically love and sugar, I thought it might be interesting to have a quick look at what the definition of love is. According to the Oxford Dictionary, it can be an intense feeling of deep affection, it can be a great interest and pleasure in something, or just liking or enjoying something very much. But what I can see in the Merriam-Webster dictionary is that the essential meaning of love is a feeling of strong or constant affection for a person, or a strong affection or desire felt by people who have a romantic relationship, or for a person you love in a romantic way. But it all looks like it's to do with people rather than with inanimate objects such as food or sugar. Now, I'm not denying that I definitely used to love sugar, and I used to need it. And in my experience, it was never an unhealthy relationship. I didn't have a problem with that type of neediness. I didn't even see it. I wasn't aware of it. And I certainly had no intention of ever letting go of sweet foods, chocolate, desserts, ice cream, you name it. Why would I want to let go of something I loved? That's why I resisted for so long when it was first suggested to me to cut down sugar. There was no way I was going to stop eating chocolate for anybody. even for myself. And I came up with all sorts of excuses why there was no way that sugar had anything to do with any of my health issues, my digestive issues, my achy joints, and even my moods. I strongly believed that my love for sugar was what was helping me cope with these problems. And as it turned out, that's what I learned when I stopped eating sugar, that I was using it as a coping mechanism, and there's nothing wrong with that. We use the coping skills that we have, and that's just fine. It's just that the irony, for me at least, was that this particular coping mechanism, which involved using sugar, was actually making my problems worse. Yes, better in the very short term, but definitely worse in the long term. Because sugar was the very thing that was involved in causing my issues, like my digestive problems, my bloating, my aches and pains, my extra weight, and what I found later when I started educating myself, it was also affecting my mood swings. So I started wondering, is it really love when what I love is actually hurting me? And the fact that I was fighting so hard against letting sugar go, even if it was causing me all these problems, not that I realized that it was at the time, but the fact that I resisted even entertaining the idea of reducing sugar may have been a sign that it was something other than love that I was feeling towards sugar. I actually felt that I couldn't stop eating sugar. In her book, When Food is Love, Janine Roth talks about compulsion. Compulsion, she says, is despair on the emotional level. Compulsion is the feeling that there is no one home. We become compulsive to put someone home. All we ever wanted was love. We didn't want to become compulsive about anything. We did it to survive. We did it to keep from going crazy. Janine Roth continues, food was our love. Eating was our way of being loved. Food was available when our parents weren't. Food didn't get up and walk away when our fathers did. Food didn't hurt us. Food didn't say no. Food didn't hit. Food didn't get drunk. Food was always there. Food tasted good. Food was warm when we were cold and cold when we were hot. Food became the closest thing we knew of love. But Janine Roth also says, but it is only a substitute for love. Food is not, nor was it ever, love. Tough to hear for someone like me who loved sugar and who loved food. In fact, I still love food now, but the type of love that I feel for food has totally changed. It's not a need for it to fill some kind of void anymore, but more a sensory enjoyment of the look, the smell, and the taste of food. And of course, the feeling I get from eating food that actually nourishes me rather than replacing some other need. This makes me think of a book that I read, years ago, The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck. And in it, Peck gives a very unique definition of love. He says, love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. And of course, this is impossible to do with an inanimate object like sugar. And without mentioning sugar specifically, Scott Peck introduces a term called cathexis, which is the act of investing mental or emotional energy in a person, object, or idea. And he says we can cathect many things: money, power, fame, a piece of jewelry, our pets, our hobbies, as well as other people, and I would add also food and sugar. Scott Peck beautifully describes how cathexis is not love. Cathexis is attachment and investment in a person or a thing, And Peck also cautions about mistaking dependency for love. He says that dependency is the inability to experience wholeness or to function adequately without the certainty that one is being actively cared for by another. He talks about two people when he says that allowing yourself to be dependent on another person is the worst possible thing you can do to yourself. If you expect another person to make you happy, says Scott Peck, you'll be endlessly disappointed. And what would happen if you replace person with sugar? If you expect sugar to make you happy, you'll be endlessly disappointed. Well, I have to admit, that's a pretty good point. And I don't know if you're like me, but I used to deeply believe that I loved chocolate and sugar. I never even thought of questioning why. And it's funny because now that I'm free from sugar, I now see it as some kind of a screen, like it used to prevent me from actually feeling emotions, including love. Because all I was looking to do as soon as I had some kind of uncomfortable emotion was to smother it in chocolate, quite literally. And throughout the last few years that I've been sugar-free, I've actually come up with this new concept that I call nowhere to hide, nothing to hide. Because once you take away that screen of sugar or comfort foods, what you actually have to do is to deal with your emotions. And some of us would rather run far, far away than do that. And I totally get that. I did it up to the age of 45. And I think a large part of it was because I just never learned how to deal with emotions. Nobody had ever taught me. So dealing with them by eating, and eating sugar and chocolate especially, was the only way I knew how. And it was the same for when I felt stressed or frustrated or even in need of celebration. Eating, especially sweet foods and chocolate, seemed to me to be the only option. And even the idea of not having those comfort foods anymore, giving them up, was just so scary because I just couldn't imagine what I would do without them. I mean, I'd have nothing to look forward to on a Friday night. I'd have nothing to celebrate with on my birthday or on someone else's birthday or with friends and family. I imagined that everyone else would be having fun in their lives except me because sugar and sweet foods were my fun. Does that make sense? I mean, I suppose it didn't even make sense for me because that kind of attachment that I used to have to sugar and that you may have as well goes beyond making sense. It's not logical. And the fear of missing out is also not logical. And when I did finally pluck up the courage to actually try cutting sugar and sweet foods, well, that's my point. It took courage. But at some point, I remember thinking, Netta, you need to grow up. In the sweetest possible way, I had to give myself a bit of a talking to, because if I didn't start changing how I relate to my emotions, I wouldn't ever learn how to deal with them as an adult. I mean, full disclosure, this certainly didn't happen before I cut sugar. I just kind of threw myself into it without thinking too much, like I do for most things. But when I realized after a couple of weeks without sugar and sweet foods and starchy foods, that this was actually helping me on other levels that I'd never imagined, including dealing with my own emotions, this is when I started taking a step back and really taking stock of what kind of ripple effect cutting sugar could have on my life. A positive ripple effect, one that I would never have imagined. In fact, I'd imagined the worst. It's funny because life after sugar, as I call it now, is sort of the opposite of what I'd imagined before. Have you heard people say that they'd rather live a short and happy life with sugar than a long and boring, joyless life without sugar? I've lost count of the number of times that people have said that to me. even though I've told them how wonderful my life is now, that I've lost my sugar habit and how free I feel because I don't need or miss or even like sugary and sweet foods anymore. It's kind of impossible for most people to imagine, as it was for me. And that love, or what I considered to be love, for sweet foods and chocolate and desserts and bread and everything, well, I still have that love, but now it's just for other things. So I haven't actually lost out on anything. In fact, I've gained because I've kept all the love and enjoyment of food, but what I actually lost was all the negative side effects that sugar was giving me, like my bad digestion and bloating and achy joints and bad sleep and extra weight, and generally feeling like I was powerless when I was reaching out for sugar whenever I felt tired or stressed or frustrated or even in need of some kind of reward. And this is why I created Life After Sugar, to show that life can be joyful and happy and positive and enjoyable even when you don't eat sugar. And that actually dropping sugar leaves you free to love things that don't do you any harm. And this is what I share on my Facebook page, Life After Sugar, on my Instagram account at My Life After Sugar, because that's where I post pictures of what I eat and what I do and, generally Instagram stuff to inspire you and show you all the positive aspects of Life After Sugar. Sure, real life carries on whether you're eating sugar or not, but there's certain things that we have no control over, like, a pandemic, say? So you might as well feel healthier and happier with all the things that you can't control and more empowered with the things that you can control, like what you put in your mouth and your relationship with your food and especially with sugar. And that's also why I created the monthly membership, the After Sugar Club, as well as the more intensive 6-week Life After Sugar program, because it's not easy to get to that place of feeling free from sugar on your own. Ask me how I know. And what most people need, at least I certainly did, is input from someone who's been there about how to implement sugar-free living day in, day out in a sustainable way. What do we eat? How can we recreate our family favorites, our traditional dishes? What do we do at celebrations and at meals with friends and family? What do we do when we are at a restaurant, on the road, when it's our birthday? How do we live real life sugar-free when real life happens? And then we get tired and stressed and overwhelmed, or we want to celebrate with ice cream or cake or chocolate. How do we actually live life after sugar? So the monthly membership, the After Sugar Club, and the 6-week Fast Track Life After Sugar program are designed to give you all the support, the encouragement, the guidance, and the accountability you need to start living your sugar-free life and then to make it sustainable. Want to know more? Go to aftersugarclub.com and click on the green button Join the Club to check out our monthly membership, the After Sugar Club, or click on the Program tab to put your name on the wait list for the 6-week intensive Life After Sugar program, where you get weekly support and lots of step-by-step guidance from me to get started on living your sugar-free life and especially to make it sustainable. That's aftersugarclub.com and click on the Program tab. And you can also surf around the website and make the most of all the free resources there, including my 5 tips for getting rid of cravings. And also don't forget to check out the Life After Sugar YouTube channel for more tips. Okay, so this episode is a special Valentine's episode about how I and possibly you, equate sugar with love. I mean, I don't know how many hundreds of times I used to say that I loved sugar and I loved chocolate and I loved desserts and cookies and ice cream and bread and pasta, and the list goes on. And if you don't eat those foods anymore, does that mean that all the love goes out of your life? Or is it possible that it was never really love in the first place? Well, I thought I'd look into it on a more biological and neurological level. And what I found out, even though I'm not a scientist or a doctor or anything, is that sugar can disrupt dopamine levels as the brain becomes used to higher and higher levels of sugar. In fact, apparently, both the gene expression and availability of dopamine receptors can be altered in certain areas of the brain from consuming too much sugar over a long period of time. And the effect sugar has on dopamine and dopamine receptors makes it addictive and is why it's often so difficult to eliminate sugar from your diet. We know that sugar is harmful for our bodies, but it's also been shown to be harmful to the health of the brain. As I said, I'm no health expert or doctor or anything, so I like to quote those who are, and as a neuroscientist, Dr. Susan Peirce-Thompson has been investigating the mystery of sugar addiction all her career. So she knows the brain pretty well, and what she says about the onslaught of dopamine that sugar causes is that it makes the brain react to pleasurable stimuli wherever it comes from, including sugar. But the brain, she says, doesn't like this overload and tries to reduce it by thinning out dopamine receptors, which means that you have to eat more starchy and sugary foods to get the same hit. And that's how you end up with food cravings and fall into this soul-destroying trap of wanting more and more and more. And what she also says is that our brain has only a finite amount of willpower for us to use. So if you've ever failed at a diet or blamed yourself and your lack of discipline or lack of willpower because you believe that you can't exert enough self-control to stop eating sugar, then the good news is that self-control or willpower has nothing to do with it. And certainly there's nothing wrong with you because the way that sugar affects the brain exhausts this finite resource of willpower and prevents self-regulation in other areas, including our behavior with sweet foods. And studies on the brain have also shown a sweet preference or even sugar addiction shares neural pathways and even genes in family history. In fact, both human and animal studies have demonstrated that in some brains, the consumption of sugar-rich foods or drinks primes the release of euphoric endorphins and dopamine within the nucleus accumbens part of the brain in a manner similar to some drugs of abuse, and that the neurobiological pathways of drug and sugar addiction involve similar neural receptors, neurotransmitters, and hedonic regions in the brain. All this doesn't sound much like love to me. According to Dr. Susan Peirce-Thompson, our brain is incapable of making a wise choice about what to eat when we eat so many sugary and starchy foods. It's not our fault, because the brain isn't made to function on willpower, and it isn't made to function on all that sugar we keep giving it. That's why I was so amazed when I stopped eating sugary and starchy foods that the love that I thought I felt for those types of foods was actually not love at all. It was some kind of dependency on them, and on any level, dependency is not love. And in fact, ironically, I began to discover what real love was for my food at least, and even more so for myself, when I actually started taking care of myself, which for me included keeping sugary and starchy foods off my plate for good, my own good. And yes, I do realize that this could be seen as a very unpopular way of going about my life and choosing what I want to eat. And in my experience, most people don't actually understand how it's even possible for someone who used to love sweet foods to just not want them or miss them or even like them anymore. It doesn't seem possible. And it certainly doesn't seem attractive to most people. And I totally get that, because if I wasn't living that myself, then I wouldn't really believe that it was possible. But actually, turns out that I replaced my love for sweet foods and chocolate and desserts with my love for living a life with no more cravings, with more energy, with better focus and concentration. I love having lost my extra weight. I love having a better digestion and going to the bathroom every day and not being in pain and being bloated. I love having a more stable mood, and I love getting real good sleep. I also love not being hungry as often and doing intermittent fasting in a really intuitive way. In other words, eating when I'm hungry, knowing when I'm hungry, and not eating when I'm not hungry. And I also love having less inflammation, less pain, no more achy joints. I love being supple again. And I love the confidence that comes in knowing what foods make me feel great and what foods don't, what to buy at the grocery store and what to leave on the shelves. And I love the confidence also of knowing how to make my own fermented foods and drinks like my kombucha, my yogurt, my kimchi, my sauerkraut. And I love how these foods taste and especially how they make me feel. Can you imagine replacing the love for sugar with the love for yourself and your own well-being? So I just want to finish today with another quote from Janine Roth in her book, When Food is Love. Towards the end of her book, she talks about her own compulsive eating, and she says, "For 17 years, I ate compulsively. For 21 years, I involved myself in relationships that left me feeling the same as eating compulsively, always sick and always empty. I had no idea how to take care of myself, either with food or with people. Making myself sick from eating too much chocolate was no different from choosing partners for whom I could never be more than icing on the cake of their lives. I didn't know that eating a meal was an act of kindness and would give my body the fuel it needed to think clearly and move fluidly." She continues, "I ate to shove my feelings away. I ate to make myself disappear. I didn't know that I was worth anything." So that's also my message for you for today, for Valentine's Day, and for every other day of the year. If you do what I used to do, and you use sugar to replace love, especially for yourself, then it takes a good dose of courage to think about whether you do actually love sugar and whether you actually love yourself more. And that includes being kind to yourself and taking care of yourself and finding yourself important enough to do and to eat things that make you feel good. And being in an empathetic community that gets you and understands why you want to reduce sugar is key. And that's what the monthly membership, the After Sugar Club, is all about. That support, that encouragement, knowing that you're not alone, knowing that we get you and that we're on the same path as you, and having that accountability to actually make the changes that may not be easy at first, but that can transform your life, your relationship with food, your relationship with sugar, and especially your relationship with yourself. If you want to join us, go to aftersugarclub.com and click on the green button, Join the Club. The club is always open and we're always there for you. I hope this podcast and especially this episode has been helpful for you. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please rate it and leave me a review to let me know how this podcast is helping you to make positive and loving changes in your life after sugar. And don't forget to subscribe so that every Sunday the podcast magically appears in your podcast player. Thank you for listening. That's it for this week. Keep in touch and see you soon for another episode.